Hello and welcome back to another video with dee'stuition. Today we're going to be looking at a poem from the AQA Power and Conflict Poetry series, and this poem is Exposure by Wilfred Owen. Let's get into it. So firstly, as an overview of the poem is written from the perspective of a frontline World War I soldier, which of course Wilfred Owen was himself. And the soldier really details the struggles of what it's like to be on the front line, what that lifestyle is like, and how frightening and isolating it can be as a result of not just, of course, the gunfire and the warfare, but also the weather. And there seems to be a lot of elements of shell shock, or PTSD as we would call it now, because of the traumas that the soldiers experience on the front line and in the trenches. And weather/nature appears to be the biggest and the most fearsome enemy of all, which is quite shocking when you really think about it, because, of course, as a reader of a war poem, we would expect gunnery, an enemy, to be the biggest enemy. But, of course, on this occasion, it's actually the weather and the elements. So, in terms of the context of the poem, so Wilfred Owen is one of the most famous war poets from the First World War. He has a large collection of poetry, and it is very detailed in that it really and significantly tells the narrative of what it's like to be a frontline soldier during World War One. He had quite a negative opinion on war, and he thought that it was pointless. And of course, a lot of his thoughts and opinions are more than likely as a result of him being there and experiencing it firsthand. Owen wrote some of his best known poems from the actual trenches. So they are filled with imagery, all different types of imagery, auditory imagery, as well as sensual imagery, because of the fact that he was writing it in real time as he was experiencing these things. The weather made life really unbearable for many soldiers, and there was a particular winter in 1917 that made the misery even worse, and it was said to be the coldest winter in living memory. And as a result of that, there were a lot of illnesses that the soldiers suffered from, such as hypothermia and trench foot. It was really, really unbearable, and it was that cold winter that made it all the more unbearable. Again, as I say, just things like frostbite and exposure. Some soldiers lost fingers, and the trenches, unfortunately, didn't really provide enough shelter in order to kind of protect them from those extremely low temperatures. So it was a really, really difficult time mentally and physically for those soldiers, including obviously Owen. So, some key quotations that I've got for you from the poem that are really worth considering in terms of getting the message of the poem across and thinking about your analysis and your comparison to other poems from the anthology. So the first quotation is, "Our brains ache in the merciless iced east winds that knife us." And this is the line that opens the poem, and it's so, so important. First of all, you've got that metaphor of our brains ache. And that metaphor is really important because we get a sense of, is this physical or is this mental? Physically, their brains are aching. You know, when you've got such low temperatures, you can physically feel it in your body and in your bones, and it does affect the way you feel pain. But then you've also got our brains ache, as in, you know, those kind of the mental health issues that come along with living in the trenches and dealing with the constant warfare and the constant anxiety and the constant fears. And then the second part of this quotation is, "the merciless iced east winds that knife us." And you've got this sibilance, that repetition of that S sound, and it really highlights that the wind, this awful, really cold wind, is essentially attacking them, and it feels as if it's knives going into their bodies. And if you've ever been in extremely cold weather, you will understand, or if you've ever kind of used your hands to pick up snow and you felt that pain afterwards, you will understand what these soldiers are talking about. It feels like they are literally being attacked by the wind. all around them. And of course, trenches are open, so they would be feeling a lot of that. The second quotation, and this is something that is repeated throughout the poem, so a really, really important structural device is, but nothing happens. And again, that really highlights the anxiety because they are consistently waiting for something to happen. And a lot of the time in the trenches, in war, nothing's happening. You are literally waiting for the enemy to do something, or you're waiting for your next move, but you don't know kind of when that will happen. So you are consistently kind of on tender hooks, and you've got these consistent anxious feelings that you can't get rid of because you just don't know what will happen next, and of course when it will happen. Then the third quotation, you've got the poignant misery of dawn. And this is a really good example of irony. Now, of course, dawn generally represents a new day, hope, and a new beginning. But Owen expresses that dawn is misery for them. Every single new day is more misery for them. It's another day suffering because of the cold. It's another day suffering because of World War One. It's another day having these mental PTSD issues going on. It's another day walking around dead bodies. It's another day in the trenches that are filled with rats. So, unfortunately, a new day is never a positive thing for them, and they cannot see an end in sight in terms of war, even though, of course, when this is kind of set and written, war would have actually been finishing within the next year, but they just could not see any end in sight. Fourth quotation is, we only know war lasts, rain soaks, and clouds sag stormy. And you've got this triplet here that's used. And this triplet really again emphasizes some of the negative experiences that happen as a result of war. It talks about war lasting. They feel like this is never going to end. It feels like it's just going on and on and on repeat, and that there will be no respite from it. Rain soaks, again, kind of bringing that weather element into it. They are constantly wet. They are suffering from trench foot. They cannot get comfortable. And clouds sag stormy. And of course, if clouds are sagging stormy, then the weather is always threatening to get worse and worse. There's no sunshine. There's no, again, respite from the terrible weather. And it's just constant bombardment of nature. Nature seems to be completely against them, as well as the enemy, who is also physically against them. And then the final quotations, we cringe in holes, back on forgotten dreams, and stare snow dazed. And of course, you've got this imagery that's being used here. And this imagery is being used to kind of show that, they're stuck in these holes, in these trenches. They are thinking about all of the dreams and the ambitions that they had when they came to war, all of the propaganda that told them that war was going to be easy, that they'd be back home by Christmas, that they were going to be heroes and treated well, and women were going to love them. All of those dreams are now forgotten because the reality of war is very different. And then when it talks about them being snow days, and snow days, that verb, it's really dangerous because the weather essentially is putting them into a trance, and by them being in a trance, this puts them in a really dangerous situation, because if they are not fully able to comprehend the situation that they're in, and if they are not able to react quick enough, then it's literally the difference between life and death. So again, it just really shows that nature is being really unhelpful to them, and nature is kind of another enemy on top of the enemies that they already have. And it's just so important to recognize that Owen is saying that while they're down there in those trenches, there are just layers upon layers of misery and layers upon layers of reasons why this is such a terrible situation to be in. Finally, then, our takeaways for this poem. And the first one is that weather or nature is a huge factor in war, just as huge as the actual enemies, the actual countries that you're fighting against. Then you have that there are a range of enemies that soldiers have to contend with. And we've already recognized that those are enemies that are nature based and enemies that are human based. Then another takeaway is that Owen really highlights the misery that war can bring. They are exposed to so many negative things, and how on earth are they supposed to come back even half of the person that they left as? and also that propaganda doesn't equip young men for the realities of war. These men are being consistently lied to and sent off to a war, and therefore they are ill prepared for what they are actually going to come up against. So that's exposure, as a kind of summary of the poem. If you have any questions, if there's anything else that you would like to know about the poem, do drop me a comment and I will do my best to answer this. You know, this is a really important poem, and there are so many other poems that you can really compare this to. It's full of imagery. Yes, it's one of the longer poems, but if you really focus on those key quotations that I've given you, then you will find that you've got more than enough to kind of dig into the analysis and get something really good from it in terms of your exam responses. So thank you for watching my video. I hope it's been really helpful, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.